Question number 11, the Honourable David Parker.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for the Environment. Does he accept that people wanting a swimmable standard for rivers are seeking to stop pollution by farms, factories and towns, making otherwise swimmable rivers so dirty that they're unable to swim in at normal rather than flood flows?
Mr Speaker.
The Honourable Dr Nick Smith.
Mr Speaker, I've heard the views of hundreds of people at the 10 public meetings to date on the government's proposals to strengthen the national freshwater requirements on councils, but it's impossible to define them as a single point of view. Some have expressed a view that we should legislate for all water bodies to be swimmable all of the time, even though this is not practical. Most people, including myself, want tougher pollution rules that will ensure our rivers are swimmable for as often as possible. I am open-minded about the swimmability provisions and making more explicit to regional councils that New Zealanders expect to be able to swim in their local river, as long as these provisions are practical and enforceable.
Supplementary question, the Honourable David Parker.
Why does he and the Prime Minister keep putting up false excuses against swimmability, like poor water quality when rivers are in flood?
The Honourable Dr Nick Smith.
Mr Speaker, I would note that when Prime Minister John Key was elected to office, New Zealand had no national rules around water quality. Absolutely none at all. So do take it as a little bit rich from a member of the former government to be complaining about the rules that this government has put in place, because they are the toughest rules that have been ever put in place by a government around improving freshwater quality in New Zealand and about improving swimmability of our waterways.
Point of order, Mr Speaker.
Point of order, the Honourable David Parker.
An interesting answer, but it didn't address my question, which was short and straight.
No, the point was, the member in his question uses the words putting up false excuses and order. And the Minister took the opportunity to rebut that quite strongly. Point of order, the Honourable David Parker.
He didn't, sir. He didn't provide any explanation as to why they're saying that flooded rivers are why they can't impose that standard.
He addressed the issue of whether the Prime Minister himself were putting up false excuses.
Supplementary.
Supplementary question, the Honourable David Parker.
Does he accept he made the Prime Minister look foolish adopting the flooded river excuse for polluted rivers on national radio yesterday, when New Zealanders don't go swimming in silt-laden rivers in flood that could sweep them away to their death?
Mr Speaker.
The Honourable Dr Nick Smith.
The only politician I've seen looking foolish is the Leader of Opposition that occurs so frequently that it's almost a daily event.
Order. Order. Just answer the question. Order. Order. I accept the question had its political take, but if the member could address the question.
Mr Speaker, there are others that are demanding that it be a legal requirement that every river, every stream, be swimmable 100% of the time. And as a practical engineer, I point out that passing such a law would mean that most water bodies would always breach that standard during high flow events, and that's why both myself and the Prime Minister are saying we want tougher rules, we want better water quality, but we also want rules that are practical for Council to enforce.
Supplementary question, the Honourable David Parker.
Does he believe New Zealanders should normally be able to swim in their local river?
Mr Speaker,
the Honourable Dr
yes,
Nick Smith.
I do, and that is why this government has invested over $300 million in clean-ups. That is why this government has put the first national regulations in place in respect of water metering. And for those members who say it's getting worse, I point this out. The very first time that a dairy farm expansion or new consent has been turned down has been under our government as a consequence of NPSs. And if they travel to Southland, if they travel to Hawke's Bay, if they travel to those areas that are water quality, any honest water quality scientist will say, firstly, that these problems go back a good 20 or 30 years, and secondly, that this government is making more progress than any in our history.
Supplementary question, the Honourable David Parker.
Given his quite proper acknowledgement last week that the main cause of declining water quality is pollution from livestock effluent and fertiliser, why can't he also admit that it's his failure to stop increased farm pollution of our rivers that's causing the problem, and why he's so out of touch with New Zealanders who just want their rivers to be swimmable?
The Honourable
Mr. Speaker.
Dr Nick Smith.
Mr. Speaker, this Parliament this afternoon is about to debate the ECAN legislation. In that legislation, the Commissioners have actually put red zones in a third of Canterbury that have actually limited agricultural expansion. Now, actually, the Regional Council was in place for 20 years and never put any limits in place on the expansion of agriculture. In areas like Southland, in areas like Hawke's Bay, in areas like the Waikato, it is only during the term of this government that those diffuse pollution issues that are so challenging are actually being addressed.
Question number 12.